Привет, товарищи. Uh, hello, this is Leo.
All
This is
right.
Julius Caesar. Ah, nice.
All right.
Yeah,
Cool.
okay, cool.
Okay, so now we can start. We have 4 people. Let's hope some other people join. Wait, are you actually Russian though, or you just know some Russian?
Know a little bit of Russian.
All right. Cool. Wait, Ahmed Ibrahim. I never understood. Are you Russian or not? Let's wait for him to reply there in the chat.
I don't think that Ahmed is Russian. Are you Albanian patriot?
Yeah.
There's a friend of mine. I invited a friend of mine from Albania, known as Albanian Patriot.
All right. Well, anyways, hopefully some other people will join, so we can start off. So, first of all, for all you guys who don't know what's going on, basically what's happening is we are finishing off our collaboration about this series called Albtraum Der Republikaner. Again, sorry for the German, but it's essentially what if the United States had a king. So
Albtraum Der Republikaner.
Yes, that's much better. And so part 1 was on his channel, part 2 is on my channel, part 3 was on his channel, and so we got covered all the way up to World War II. So if you guys don't know what happened, I would recommend you watch that first. I mean, I guess since it's live, probably better not to, but essentially to recap, Prussia sends a king over to America. America has a Prussian king, and so they're much more pro-Prussian. And during World War I and World War II, they sided with Germany instead. And so we're basically at the point right after World War II. So, shoot, the screen quality sucks again, but whatever.
And to give you a little more information about, what happened during World War II. In World War II, the French became fascist, along with a coalition of the various Latin nations, so Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Britain. Russia became communist. They tried to attack, and so it was the American Empire, the American Kaiserreich, Empire of Japan, and German Kaiserreich up against the Latin bloc, the British, the Pact of Rome, the communists. So basically, Allies versus Axis. Except the war is a little more ambiguous in this timeline because of a specific nation that we will get to. The ambiguity in this war is due to Japan. The crimes committed by Imperial Japan were worse than the Nazis, and the Americans, and the Soviet Union combined, but the Americans allowed Imperial Japan to side with them, just as they allowed the Soviet Union to side with them.
All right. Okay. So
thanks. The Soviet Union was
thanks for the context. So basically, I'll explain what goes on after this. So, because Japan doesn't actually get defeated in this war and are semi-aligned with, well, I guess U.S. and Prussia, they stay in power. But what goes on after that is a rivalry kind of develops between the U.S., so American Empire, and Japan. And so Japan during the war had actually taken Australia and New Zealand since they were at war with the British, but with the British being even more weak than they already were in our timeline, took that land. But, obviously being so huge and so far away, they were always kind of hard to control anyways, and with the huge cultural differences, it was only a matter of time before the Australians and New Zealanders rebel. And so, right after the war, I think 1946-47, they start rebelling, and they get support from the American Empire, which both wants to weaken Japan and also help, their fellow English speakers.
Germanic nations.
Yeah, exactly.
Their fellow Germanic nations.
And so what goes on is that a war breaks out between the two powers, and with the American Navy being so powerful, even more powerful in this timeline with all of Canada as well, and just a bigger landmass in general, they use that to basically, send their troops. I mean, not send their troops, send their navy down to around what's the area of Indonesia and kind of block the Japanese off there. And so with a smaller and weaker navy, the Japanese can't really do anything to stop the Americans from essentially helping the Australians and New Zealanders. And, with such a huge amount of space to cover, the Japanese troops stuck inside there are outnumbered and surrounded. And so although they fight to the death being Japanese, and commit a lot of atrocities, this only actually worsens their situation, because as they keep continuing to commit more atrocities, more and more people turn against them. So eventually some American troops land on the ground and help get rid of the Japanese. And so a kind of unofficial maritime border is created between Japan and Australia. And so that becomes, well, the de facto limit of the Japanese Empire. And otherwise, after this, there is kind of a peace, but there is a sort of Cold War that develops between Japan and the American Empire. And so it's only a matter of time before it breaks out, before another war breaks out. So in this time, Pol Pot, the communist dictator, is actually supported by the Americans, and leads an anti-Japanese rebellion in Cambodia, because Cambodia in this timeline is still controlled by Japan. So with the help of the Thais, they begin an insurgency. And so Thailand, the Americans, and Pol Pot and his communist Cambodians all lead a rebellion against Japan. And so that is kind of the beginning of, I guess, second major Japanese-American war, but is still more of a proxy conflict, just like the first war. And so the U.S. and Japan don't actually full-on invade each other. Instead, the U.S. sends support to the Cambodian rebels, and I'm Thailand
guessing
as
due
well.
to the sheer brutality of Japan, I think that they would probably be the most likely to win.
Yeah.
Because I don't even think that Pol Pot would be as horrific as the Japanese Empire. If you don't believe me, look up Nanking. Look up Unit 731. And a lot of the war crimes in Japan that were committed, look at how the Japanese turn Nanking into fucking entertainment publicly at home.
Yeah, he's correct. And
not even the Nazis were that bad. Not even the Stalinists were that bad.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, when you combine all that with Japanese geographic advantage, controlling all of Southeast Asia apart from Thailand, they basically just sort of surround Thailand, and to some extent Cambodia, and just kind of push more and more until they reach Bangkok and they surround Bangkok. And the U.S. doesn't really want to sacrifice all its troops there. And so although it does send some troops, it kind of becomes unpopular. This is, after all, the 1960s. And so this kind of becomes like the Vietnam of this alternate history, where the United States basically, kind of just evacuates. They kind of give up in a sense, and then Pol Pot is captured and, of course, is executed in Thailand, is fully integrated into Japan, as the Japanese no longer trust the Thais as vassal states. And so that is what happened. But again, this is also a time for a change in the Americas themselves, because in the American Empire we still kind of have like the civil rights movement, just like what happened in the U.S. in this timeline.
Yeah.
And
I would say, however, the civil rights movement, it would be less of a racial thing and more of a public democracy thing.
Yes.
Mainly because...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was sort of thinking that the Germans, they used the African Americans, which were very grateful for the German liberation against slavery. I'm
Yeah.
thinking that the Germans and the African Americans, they sort of came into a coalition against the Anglos.
Yeah. And so in a sense, basically, the civil rights movement kind of turns into like just an anti-establishment movement, and so of course there's the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. It's also, the whole German African American alliance, and in addition to that, there are also some who want the monarchy to have less power since they see it as kind of antiquated, and so the beginnings of a more constitutional monarchist movement also begin in the American Empire, and they want the emperor to have less power. And then finally, when we get to the 1970s, we finally Japan and the American Empire have really just had enough. They've kind of fought proxy conflicts all over Southeast Asia, whether it's Thailand, Cambodia, Australia, and New Zealand, and other places. And they eventually just decide to go to war, although Japan is basically, both of them kind of feel threatened in a way. Japan is getting weaker and losing control because it has to keep sending so many soldiers to prevent rebellions.
And whatever Kaiser America would have
Yeah.
for that type of war to begin,
Yeah.
he would have to be a very, very much of a hardliner Kaiser.
Yeah.
I'm sort of thinking that there would be... I'm thinking there would be a slogan that the Americans would say, Tokyo and Nanking, no difference.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Because the Americans, they would be, whatever Vietnam vets, in our timeline, the Vietnam War was a war of lies, it was a war of deceit, it was a war of corruption. In this timeline, it was simply a war that America lost voluntarily to preserve its morality. And so even though the Americans lost, whatever Vietnam veterans, they would fully support that war. Whatever liberals, it would be a very unifying factor.
Indeed. And the thing is also, America would kind of feel threatened because as Japan advanced, they would be getting more nuclear technology. And so although Japan feels threatened by rebellions, America feels threatened by Japan, which it sees as becoming stronger, even though Japan sees itself as becoming weaker. And so because of this miscommunication in general, mistrust, they go to war in what becomes known as the Second Pacific War, which is a full-out war between Japan and the American Empire. And although this is a nuclear war, it's not just like, each side just sends a bunch of nukes and there's no actual fighting. Like, it's more like the Pacific War in our time. But
the Japanese, they would probably try to avoid sending nukes.
Yeah.
They'd probably only want to use nuclear weapons as a last resort because they know that if America and Japan went to a full-on nuclear war,
yeah, they would lose.
Japan would be the ultimate loser because America's bigger, it's more wide. The Japanese, their nukes, maybe they don't necessarily have as much range.
Yeah.
Japan would be in an overall worse shape in civilian life than they were in our timeline. And then, simply because there would be parts of Japan that were undeveloped, and this would begin to show.
Yeah. And so, essentially, it starts off more as a conventional war. The U.S. lands its troops in Australia, and then, with the help of Indonesian nationalists, helps them rebel against the Japanese. With Indonesia being so many islands and so large, it's hard for the Japanese to keep control of such a huge amount of territory. And so they mostly retreat to the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia, where they can have more of a hold. And so basically, we'll just call them the Allies because Australia and New Zealand obviously are fighting in this war as well.
I mean, we could still call them the Central Powers as well, because the Central Powers weren't necessarily really broken down after
Yeah,
World War II.
yeah,
I am sort of thinking that America and Germany, they began to go their separate ways because Germany, they had their own ideals for Europe.
yeah. And in fact, Germany doesn't really care that much about the war in Japan, and so they kind of just begin drifting away. But basically, what happens is that the Americans eventually manage to land in Malaya, so that's like the mainland part of Malaysia, and then Thailand rebels because they're still mad at Japan for having annexed them after the whole war, the Cambodian Pol Pot and all that. So together they quickly take
Cambodia
over.
revolts, Vietnam revolts,
Yeah,
Burma revolts.
and in fact, yeah, with a lot of ironically communist support, most of Southeast Asia rebels. So the Japanese are like kind of stuck in an impossible situation, especially with
And
jungle
plus
warfare.
there's China, which Japan invaded as
Yeah,
well.
and so basically Japan kind of just retreats to southern China where there's a lot more mountains and the weather is a little better. And so basically America kind of needs to have like one final push to get rid of Japan, and so they organize what would essentially become the D-Day in this scenario. And so they decide to land at Nanking, and not just because of strategic location, but also because of its symbolic significance, being the place where the Japanese massacred all the Chinese. And so they plan a huge amphibious assault there. They land in Nanking, and so with the help of the communists and the nationalists and just the regular armies, they start pushing north from the border between Southeast Asia and China, and then east from Nanking, and so they kind of push down to liberate all of China. And of course, the Chinese nationalists also help because China is such a huge area, so without Chinese help, they wouldn't really be able to do it. But with China having been under Japanese oppression for at this point 40 years, the Chinese are more than willing to rise up, and so America employs a communist agitator called Mao Zedong, and so they ask him to, well, they basically use him to kind of lead this Chinese rebellion against the Japanese. And so altogether, they clear the Japanese from mainland Asia, and so the Japanese are just pushed into Korea. And from here, with the Americans being now in Beijing, they're close enough to Japan to really use their nukes, and so you still kind of see Hiroshima and Nagasaki, maybe some other places, I'm not sure.
Oh,
maybe,
yeah, Tokyo.
yeah,
Tokyo,
probably
too.
nuke Tokyo as well. And so they once all these cities are destroyed, Japan, although Japanese, as we know, they really fight to the death, having lost basically their entire empire, and also being less fanatic since it wasn't that they just created their empire. Their empire had been there for like 4 decades. They weren't as dedicated, and so eventually Japanese just willingly surrender, and they don't need.
I'm thinking that in the surrender, there would be some sort of massive scene. Oh, Donald Trump. Hang on. Okay, I'm back.
All right, he's back.
Yeah. I'm thinking that sometime during the Japanese surrender, the American forces, the Japanese emperor, is forced to bow to the Kaiser. Of America.
And this is super humiliating because remember the Japanese thought the emperor was actually God, so it was no like small deal that. And so basically, it's like a show. It's the ultimate show of who's in charge. The Americans are making sure the Japanese know that they're in charge.
Yeah.
But essentially, this is what ends the war. And so from now on, I'll let Julius Caesar talk about what happens after this war. Basically, from the 80s until now, what goes on. So go ahead.
Okay. So following the surrender of Imperial Japan, there's a little bit of a conflict within America. The Americans aren't necessarily 100% on their game. They're bogged down. They know the war happened. The Japanese emperor, they bowed to the Kaiser. I'm thinking America would probably be occupying Japan for a while. Whatever regimes in East Asia would be pro-American. But
Yes.
a lot of these regimes that would be set up would be essentially democratic. And the Americans, even though the Americans are a monarchy, they're a very antiquated traditional monarchy, they're somewhat in favor of allowing whatever democratic regimes exist to exist. They deserve it. They deserve the type of government that they want. And, they'd allow the communists to exist, they'd allow the Democrats to exist simply because they deserve the government that they want. However, Japan, fuck no, they're not getting the type of government that they want.
That's true.
We're going to say that, however, America, the situation would be a little different. A lot of Americans, they wanted that same type of democracy that foreign nations had. They wanted that same type of social liberalism and all that. And so the youth of America, now that the war with Japan is over, now that the Japanese emperor, who is viewed as a god, bowed down to the Kaiser of America, now that Japan is basically an occupied colony of America, and it would probably remain as one to this day, the Americans would begin to consider. They would wonder, well, what did Japan do that was so evil? Well, Japan, they were an empire. They were a monarchy. They had a strong dictatorship. They had the desire for territorial growth. They were ambitious. Oh shit, that's sort of similar to our nation. And so American liberals would probably want America to go more liberal. Whatever liberal movement exists in the Kingdom of America.
All right, yeah. In fact, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That essentially this victory with Japan and Americans seeing all these democracies pop up is kind of what inspires the Americans themselves to ask for more democratic, government. And so America shifts from an absolute, well, not completely absolute, but for at least for modern standards, pretty absolute monarchy to a more constitutional monarchy. And who would be the leader of this movement?
Bill Clinton. Why? You know that scene he did with the saxophone, right? In that television? It's sort of... He gave the democratic movement, in this timeline, a face. He gave a charming, solid face of an American gentleman, of an American who's very prone for democracy. Lead the American people to once again become a democracy. And he would be less present himself than the rest of the Americans, than the people themselves. And so in the 1990s, and so towards the late 1980s, there eventually becomes some sort of protocol, and the Germans, they have dominated American culture. German would be, in this timeline, the official language of America. But a lot of the Americans, they wouldn't know English. Well, they wouldn't know German. A lot of the Americans, they would have been speaking English since the Revolution. They would have been speaking English since America's inception. And so, by 1991, by Christmas on 1991, some type of treaty is made between the some type of treaty is made within America. And one of the things that creates this treaty and really mandates it is that the Kaiser, he is forced to change his title from Kaiser to king.
Yeah, and so in a kind of ironic and cool way, America does go back to having a king because remember, kind of the whole question is what if America had a king? And so they have first they have a republic, then they have king, and then of course a few republics in between, and then the empire. But now they go back to having a king, and so it kind of all comes full circle to this where America does end up having a king again, and it is more like the America we see today. Of course, they still have the monarchy, but in terms of like democratic systems, it's more like the America we see today.
Yeah, we would see people like Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. And another thing, English would be the official language, would be made the official language of America.
Yeah.
And the reason being is that the American people, sometime in the 1990s, they'd go back to accepting English. And a lot of the reason is because it's the language the founding fathers spoke.
Yeah.
It's the language of not the Constitution, but it is the language of the Declaration of Independence. It's the language of the Bill of Rights. It's the language of guaranteed liberty.
Yeah. And so basically, kind of to like conclude all this, it kind of all comes together in the sense that, there's way less tension, tension between the European and African populations, tensions between the Germans and the English, tensions between the monarchists and Republicans. And so America kind of comes to a compromise where they have, both German and English heritage, being preserved. Everyone, regardless of the race, has rights and has liberties and is allowed to live freely.
That was true since the formation of the Kaiserreich.
Yeah.
Where everybody had the same racial rights, but well, not necessarily everybody, but a lot more than in, say, our America.
And then finally, the monarchists and the Republicans also kind of come on a compromise where, they don't have a republic, but, the monarch's power is limited and he's no longer the emperor. And so I think in terms of foreign policy, the last major thing we're going to discuss is that Mitteleuropa, which is basically kind of like the German sort of colonial empire in Eastern Europe, that kind of collapses. And the best, I guess, example that we can relate this to is the collapse of Yugoslavia. And so,
although there would be a little less genocide, a little less craziness.
Yeah, but
there would be
Julius Caesar. Why don't you talk about just that and how it goes?
Okay. Well, the Americans the Middle Europeans. What would happen? Poland and Ukraine would want to separate from Germany. The Baltics would want their own independence, but there would be some wars, and for example, one of the most controversial topics would be for Belarus. And so what would eventually happen would be that Russia would want to conquer Belarus. They would want to rebuild their power within that. And the Americans, they would intervene. But their intervention would be a lot less within Middle Europe than, say, with Japan, where they put boots in the ground. They occupied Tokyo, and the Emperor of Japan was forced to bow down and admit the Kaiser's superiority. In this version of America, well, in this version of the world, not so much. The Emperor of, well, within Middle Europe, not so much. So you'd have some troops, say, supporting the Germans, the Polish, trying to get some sort of agreement to occur.
Yeah. And so
So it would be,
the Americans are kind of
in-
like the mediators.
yeah, and in a sense it would be like, in a sense it would be like the Yugoslav wars because everybody is against each other. But in reality, not really, because it would be a lot less brutal, and it would be a lot more tamer than the Yugoslav conflict.
Yeah.
So no, you don't get German turbofolk.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this.
I would like to sort of go over a couple more points.
Okay, sure.
Number one, with Western Europe, I'm sort of thinking, do any of you have good ideas of what could happen to Western Europe?
I mean, at least my opinion would be probably that we could have just Western Europe sort of becomes more stable and democratic as it does in our time. Maybe some sort of proto-EU forms. Not as expansive as the one we see today, but maybe something similar to that, some sort of economic union. Of course, we've already talked about what goes on in America.
Yeah.
Latin America is, mostly the same. Same with Africa. But yeah, Asia is basically just much more Western aligned, especially with the whole war with Japan. And Japan is still occupied by the United States. You have any other points?
I'm sort of thinking that by the... I do have another thing to add after this, but I'm sort of thinking that by the 1990s,
Yeah.
at the same time that Japan becomes independent, well, at the same time that the Americans become more of a democratic nation, I'm thinking that Japan is given its independence.
Yeah, we could do that. That would make sense.
But there would be a bit of confusion. It would end up like Germany, so they would have hefty war reparations to pay. There would be less support. So say after the earthquakes and floods that happened in Japan in real life, there would be less sympathy towards Japan.
Yeah.
It would be a huge controversy as to whether to give stuff to Japan instead of honoring their culture and sort of allowing them to, feeling sorry for them. This timeline would be a lot more controversial. Should we give that stuff to Japan? Can Japan do, or no?
I mean, I say, yeah, that's a good idea. I think that would be more realistic, especially because I don't think America would be occupying Japan for like 40 years. But, sometime maybe around 2000, Japan gets independence. Any last points? Otherwise, I think I'll just kind of give my concluding thoughts.
Another thing, what happened to Russia?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, basically with World War II, Soviet Union basically collapses. And so we kind of have a situation more with modern Russia. So after Japan, obviously, collapses, Russia has full control over Siberia, and of course they still have control over Alaska as well, because that was never given over. But Russia is sort of like Russia today, in the sense that it's not like as anti-Western as the Soviet Union, but it's not pro-Western either. But Russia is kind of in a weird state because it has no real friends. Obviously, it doesn't like Germany, it doesn't like Japan, and it's not a huge fan of America either. And so it's kind of just its own regional power.
I do have a question. Before the Soviet Union was invented, Russia had a decent relationship with the U.S. And didn't the Americans restore Russian monarchy to power?
Yes, they did.
After the Soviet Union collapsed?
I mean, at least my idea was kind of they drifted away just because as Russia becomes so powerful and isolated, they don't need the